So, sort of a next chapter. Pharynx, esophagus, deglutition, swallowing. So, here's what happens. Let's talk about anatomy first, actually. Two parts of pharynx that we are interested here: oropharynx and laryngopharynx. We're going to go back to these parts when we will discuss respiratory system. For now, if you think about it, so you've got oropharynx and laryngopharynx. They are covered by stratified squamous epithelium, right? Now, why? Because food, when it goes through the alimentary canal, it passes through those structures. You look at nasopharynx, and it's totally different. It's pseudostratified columnar, so the one that is not resistant to the friction, right? So totally different story. This is why, we kind of, when we swallow, we try to prevent food from entering our nasopharynx and nose in general, and we're going to talk about it. So pharynx is connected, and I'm going to do a little bit of So this is kind of schematic idea of the alimentary canal. So this is going to be your oropharynx and then laryngopharynx together. And this is the stomach. This is esophagus. Does that make sense? Have you ever wondered what's going to happen if you take, sometimes I sound like a torturous kind of a person. If you take a 1 or 2 year old kid who just ate and flip them upside down and shake a little bit, like what's going to happen? They will barf. Why? Esophagus is not open, generally speaking, but there is some lumen there. Esophagus is stretched out, okay? So, to prevent food from going back, from going from the stomach back into the esophagus and then back into the laryngopharynx and oropharynx, there are sphincters here and here, okay? So this is upper esophageal sphincter, and this is gastroesophageal sphincter. Does that make sense? So what essentially happens, we're going to get to the whole swallowing reflex in a second, but what happens here, check this out. When you swallow, this sphincter opens, right? And it opens because basically food presses on the walls of the pharynx. It always serves as a signal. So like, think of it, if you think of alimentary canal as a tube, okay? And I don't have any proper tube here. Okay, so I don't have any proper tube, but if my fist is a foot, as it moves down, it exerts pressure on the walls. That pressure signals to the muscle cells in front of the foot, relax. Muscle cells behind the foot, contract, So it will signal, okay, for the sphincter to open, food passes into the esophagus, right? Sphincter closes behind it, but peristalsis in the esophagus keeps moving food downward. Does that make sense? Just like, we talked about peristalsis a little bit when we talked about smooth muscle back in AP1, but basically it's the contraction of circular and longitudinal muscles just propelling food forward. And then, look, when food comes close to gastroesophageal sphincter, this sphincter opens, and food gets in the stomach and sphincter closes, right? One of the sort of, let's put it this in the perspective. So if you have a patient who has troubles like swallowing all the way through, so basically you can see that the food kind of leaves the oral cavity and gets into the pharynx, but it has hard time getting through the esophagus. What does it tell you? So, go ahead.
The sphincters are opening.
That's one situation. Or if they are opening and the food kind of enters the esophagus but then gets stuck there, which part of the alimentary canal is not functioning properly? What propels the food?
The esophagus.
Which layer? What moves? What moves all the things in a human body? What tissue? Which tissue is responsible for movement? Come on. You're moving because what happens? What does this?
Your muscles contract.
Yeah.
Okay.
Muscles. So it's known that in some infectious diseases, pretty exotic, the muscles in the esophagus get infected basically and lose their contractile ability. It's called megaesophagus. And people just, there's no peristalsis. Food just gets stuck in the esophagus. It's pretty unpleasant condition, I think. Does that make sense? So, what happens during the deglutition? During the swallowing? So we can do it step by step. It all starts with the food in the mouth, right? So it's called a bolus of food, and this bolus of food in the mouth is moved into the pharynx, oropharynx, and then laryngopharynx by the tongue. Right? So this is entirely voluntary process. Okay? It's your decision whether to swallow the food that's in your mouth or not. So food now is in the pharynx. So one of the key stimuli, and we get in there. So I failed to mention it before. There are basically two kinds of stimuli in the digestive system, mechanical and chemical, right? So for salivation reflex, the stimulus will be chemical. For deglutition, the stimulus is mechanical because food essentially stretches the pharynx, right? So, few things happen when food stretches. I'm going to put here, stretch. So this serves uvula, a little muscular structure in the back of your soft palate. When you open your mouth, like you can see it, it's hanging over there. Uvula closes nasopharynx. Does that make sense? Epiglottis closes trachea. So now you have both parts of the respiratory cavity blocked from food, okay? upper esophageal sphincter opens, this one, and muscles contract and, move the foot down.
So the sphincter is relaxing, but the muscles in the esophagus are contracting.
Good question. Not yet. Not yet. Basically, your pharyngeal muscles, they contract and push it through the open sphincter. Muscles here.
Are always open?
No. Okay, so when muscles contract, pharyngeal muscles contract, they push foot towards the sphincter. That push opens it. It's basically a little local reflex.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Opens it. Basically, your pharynx stuffs the foot into the esophagus. And then you have sort of a domino effect in the smooth muscle. When food gets into the esophagus stretches. Does that make sense? That stretch signals the smooth muscle cells in front of the foot. Relax. So they relax, the cells behind the foot contract, and they're like squeezing the food constantly through the tube of the esophagus. Does that make sense? It's interesting, esophagus is not entirely smooth muscle. I should correct myself here. So we've got, basically, if we draw an esophagus and break it into three parts here, skeletal plus smooth, and smooth. Gotta say, despite the fact that it's skeletal muscle structurally, you do not control it voluntarily. Like, you cannot stop it in the tracks in the esophagus and say, no, I'm not swollen. That makes sense? Couple of features. The esophagus is still stratified squamous epithelium. Okay? And doesn't have serosa. Instead, it has a pretty strong connective tissue outside that secures it in two other organs called adventitia. That make sense? Esophagus is not like a particularly exciting organ, just a tube. So, any questions on the anatomy? Okay, so again here, like, try to think about the whole. What I like about digestive system, many steps you can almost imagine, like you can experience them. So the bolus of food is moved by the tongue towards the pharynx. You push it back voluntarily, it ends up in the pharynx, stretches it. Uvula closes, epiglottis closes. Uvula closes, nasopharynx, epiglottis closes, trachea. Upper esophageal sphincter opens, food is in the esophagus. Esophagus keeps doing peristalsis, pushing food towards the lower or gastroesophageal sphincter. It opens under the pressure. Food ends up in the stomach. We're going to talk about the stomach separately. Does that make sense? Actually, one of my favorite sort of small notes, tongue-in-cheek, of course, joke. One of the main arguments against the whole idea of, people being created by God is the design of respiratory and digestive system. Because if it was some kind of a creator, it significantly questions the mental abilities of that creator who crossed two systems. When pharynx is both respiratory and digestive, and you have to do this, uval epiglottis thing, that makes no freaking sense, honestly. And this is why, for instance, when you sneeze when you eat, or you laugh when you eat, both of those respiratory moves is expulsion of air. And this is why, in this case, food can go through your nose. Because uvula is not like a great stopper, you know, it'll just blow through. And this is why after that you feel kind of crappy, because the pseudostratified epithelium in the nasopharynx is damaged. Make sense? Questions?